Welcome. It's lovely to see everybody this Sunday. Mike?
Good morning. I'm delighted to welcome you here to this special place. My name is Mike Owens. I use the pronouns he and him, and I have the delight of being your worship associate this morning. Also participating in our service this morning is the Reverend Gail Mariner, our music director, Lydia Madrick, our singing maestro, Del Wilkinson, our tech team, Michael Morford, John Lehman, and Jim Asparo, the greeters, and the office staff, and the parking lot monitors, and everyone else who contribute to making this morning happen. I have a brief announcement before we get started singing our first song. On May Day, there will be an evening rally at the Roundhouse. And the blurb shows here. Says it, the day we are standing united against corporation elites. We will not let them erase labor rights, break our unions, and silence immigrant voices. If you'd like to participate, please meet in the UU parking lot at 4:15. Dirk Haskin will be the one coordinating that.
And he's right over here. Oh, sorry, 4:45.
I was mistaken.
My mistake.
All right, 4:45.
Go to the Roundhouse and find a
That's right, yeah.
Yep, you can just show up. That's all what it's mostly about, is showing up.
But wear your yellow hat if you've got one so we can find each other.
All right. Please join me in singing our first song, Come and Go With Me, which is number 1018 in the Teal hymnal.
Come and go to that land. Come and go with me to that land. Come and go with me to that land where I'm bound, where I'm bound. Come and go with me to that land. Come and go with me to that land. With me to that land where I'm bound. There'll be freedom in that land. There'll be freedom in that land. There'll be freedom in that land where I'm bound, where I'm bound. There'll be freedom in that land. There will be freedom in that land. There will be freedom in that land where I'm bound. There will be justice in that land. There will be justice in that land. There will be justice in that land where I'm bound, where I'm bound. There'll be justice in that land. There'll be justice in that land. There will be justice in that land where I'm bound. There'll be singing in that land. There'll be singing in that land. There'll be singing in that land where I'm bound, where I'm bound. There'll be singing in that land. There will be singing in that land. There will be singing in that land where I'm bound.
Good morning, friends. Thank you. So the words for our chalice lighting and opening come from the Reverend Scott Taylor. You ready? May this flame spark a vision of what might yet be. May the supposedly real seem a little less solid. May the inevitable reveal its carefully concealed cracks. It is all made of pieces and parts, friends. each of them longing to be rearranged. Or maybe it's a story, and we hold the pen in our hands. Brian, this is the end of the official part of our pledge campaign. And Brian is going to talk to us a little bit about where we are. Looks
Not bad. Yeah. Good morning. I'm Brian Frederickson. Some of you know me as Yoga Guy, although Gail was Yoga Guy this morning. And it's ironic they've asked me to make the sales pitch, because if my livelihood had depended upon making sales, my kids would have been running around town without shoes. But I can tell you a Zen story about a guy who knew a little bit about sales. He was a very successful merchant, and he made a lot of money. And one day, he decided to convert all his wealth into gold bars. Maybe we ought to be thinking about doing that, just as an aside. One night, he loaded up his rowboat with all his gold bars, and under the cover of a cloudy sky, he rowed out into the middle of a body of water. He poked holes in his boat and watched it sink as he jumped off the boat and swam to shore. Then he went running off into the forest to practice his yoga and meditation. I think that's a pretty interesting story, but there's one piece of it that the story doesn't talk about, and that is, did he go and join a Sangha or a Buddhist temple or some other institution that requires money to run? Because they probably would have appreciated one or two of those gold bars. Well, here we are. We're coming down the stretch at this institution that requires money to run, but we're not doing too bad. Our goal is $350,000. We are a little under $280,000. So somewhere around $75,000 short. Now, on first blush, that sounds like a lot of money, but if we can sort of break it down into realistic figures, I did that. And there are about between 40 and 45 folks who pledged last year who have not pledged yet. And if Jim and I were talking about this last week, what that amounts to approximately is, per pledge unit, $33 a week, or $130 a month. And we were thinking, $33 a week, that's like a green chili burger meal. Add Blake's Lotaburger, or a couple of them anyway. We're not talking about a lot of money here, but it's important. And it's important that we get as close to our goal as we can. Thank you for those of you who have pledged. It's greatly appreciated. You folks know there's a lot going on around here, and it requires money to operate. Those folks who have not pledged yet, we look forward to getting your pledges soon. In fact, we need them by May 10th. And the reason we need them by May 10th is that we're having our annual meeting on June 8th. And the board has to present their budget at the annual meeting. So they need some time to put the budget together. Again, thank you for all that you do here. And we look forward to moving this red mark up the chart.
Thank you, Bryson.
Our reading today comes from the book The Way of Imagination by Scott Russell Sanders. When technicians try to figure out how a given device was made or a given outcome of a computer program was achieved, they call their effort reverse engineering. They reason backward, delineating the steps necessary to produce the desired result. I have been engaged in a kind of reverse engineering, not of a device or a program, but of a healing human gesture. I want there to be more old-growth forests, and so I seek to understand what moved a person to work for the restoration. I also want there to be restored wetlands and prairies, clean and free running waters and rivers, oceans teeming with life, and every manner of wild habitats where our fellow species may thrive. I want our own species to flourish in cities and villages where the air is safe to breathe, where the water is clean to drink, and under an intact ozone layer that screens out ultraviolet rays, within a climate that is reasonably stable and predictable. I want every man, woman, and child to have enough to eat, a safe place to sleep, and a chance to live free of violence. I want our political system to serve the common good rather than the interest of the wealthy few. Our court systems to serve justice rather than ideology. Our economic systems to distribute the rewards of labor fairly, and medical systems to care for the health of all people, and schools to nurture the talents of all children. I want our news media to tell the truth, and I want there to be others, and many, many others, working to achieve these outcomes. When I reason backward from these desired results to figure out how they might be achieved, I keep finding that every step requires imagination. In artists, imagination gives rise to stories that have never been told, melodies that have never been heard, dances and designs that have never been seen. These creations may in turn give rise to pleasures and yearnings, many of them unprecedented, within anyone who reads or listens or watches. I would say as an example of this, go see the art that's out in our foyer. In science, imagination generates hunches about how some portions of nature might work, yields hypotheses that can be tested, and a vision of processes unfolding through time and space. In all of us, imagination can give rise to compassion by providing insight into the feelings and thoughts of other people. Consider what a mysterious power this is. We can see things that are actually not present before our eyes. Not only things remembered, such as childhood bedroom, but also things we have not experienced, such as climbing Mount Denali, as well as things no one has experienced, such as a journey to the stars. We can travel into the past or the future while our bodies never budge. We can lay out plans in our minds, step by step, for a meal or a house before lifting a hand to begin work. Imagination keeps us from being trapped in the present arrangement of things. We can live in the midst of slavery and envision slavery's abolition. In the midst of a society that oppresses women, we can envision them acquiring rights and equal to those of men. In the midst of a damaged land and endangered species, we can foresee their restoration.
So we're beginning a little pivot today from the theme of joy, which was our theme for April, to the theme of imagination, which is our theme for May. I think you have to imagine joy as much as you imagine anything else. So That's why we heard imagination as the song preceding the reading, and that's why our reading comes from the way of imagination. This ability to imagine a different world vividly enough that each of us can use the vision as a landmark to guide our actions is actually both a powerful and a necessary skill if we are to survive and thrive in the tumultuous times that surround us. Much of where we are now is the result of old imaginings that were perhaps life-affirming for those who imagined them initially, but have proven to be toxic for many people in the present and for our shared planet. If we're going to live our way out of our present set of predicaments, we are going to need to have very strong imaginations, each of us and all of us together, to help us find different, more life-affirming ways to live. We need strong imaginations that will frame clear visions. We need strong imaginations that can tell different stories, offer different rubrics and different images, so that when we look around us, we don't see necessarily the dark side of things. Instead, we start seeing sort of beyond them and overlaid on them possibilities for what might yet come. We need strong imaginations in order to craft visions that instead of dividing us are inclusive of every person and every living being on the planet. In fact, we need visions that are, or imaginations that are so strong that the visions that we articulate take on a life of their own and start shaping the way we behave according to the logic that is embedded in them. You see, a strong vision is like a fractal equation. You set it up, you plug in the conditions, and you let it unfold. And it keeps iterating, and every time that vision gets told, that equation gets run, it leads a little closer to the future that you hope to encounter and inhabit. And every place that that happens, the vision, the reality that starts emerging is a little bit different, because we all know Unitarian Universalism is different in Santa Fe than it is in Boston. We know that the way we live out American democracy is different in New Mexico than it is in Texas sometimes. When we get the vision clear enough, we can see a coherence between the reality in one place and the reality in another place, even though they are different. Right now, our imaginations are kind of fractured. And there are competing stories and visions being told and offered that are not necessarily life-affirming for everyone. So we need to practice affirming, joyful, life-sustaining, compassionate visions of the future. And we need to make them so real that we start living them now, not waiting to live them at some future time. So go ahead and imagine, if you would, for just a minute, old-growth forests. Imagine an ocean teeming with life. Imagine a community filled with healthy children and active elders. Imagine turning on the news and there's not a single story about violence or war. Imagine a diversified economy that isn't like what we know now, that doesn't fit the descriptors of socialism or capitalism or tyranny. I don't know. Something different. Something where everyone has enough to eat and enough medical care and good and meaningful work to do. Imagine that our stones of conscience, which we're going to move to next, imagine that they are no longer reminders of futures that we must act to bring into being, but rather reminders of the fact that we acted and transformed the world.
Each Sunday, we place 4 stones in our chalice to help us remember the struggles to which we are committed. The mountain-shaped stone acknowledges that the place where we gather was for generations the land of the Tewa-speaking peoples, and our presence here is burdened with a complex history. The geode reminds us that violence is endemic in our world, and the struggle to create peace is unending. The third stone, with fossils embedded in it, reminds us that this place was once the floor of an ocean, and that climate change is real. It reminds us to engage in the struggles of mitigation and repair. The fourth stone reminds us that freedom is precious and democracy requires continuous commitment and effort. None of these challenges will be resolved unless we and other good-hearted people around the world together work to unravel racism, mend generational patterns of violence, fight for democracy, and learn to live peacefully and regeneratively on our planet. May we find joy in these struggles.
So we continue our time together by sharing our sorrows and our joys. We know that sorrows shared are easier to carry and that joys shared are multiplied. So Mike, would you light a candle of concern for Terry Knickerbocker, who is in St. Vincent's Hospital this morning, having been admitted for breathing issues in the middle of the night. Please send healing energy to him. Our hearts go out to Gail Applegate. Her sister-in-law, Pat, died this week, and our hearts go out to her and her family. Roberta has a little concern to share with us. The mega sale is June 5 through 7, about 5 weeks away, and there are only 2 people on the planning committee. We could use 5 to 7. We'll have maybe 2 or 3 Zoom meetings, and you could help with the sale based on your schedule. You could also be cleaning out your closets and figuring out what it is you'd like to donate. All right, I'm not sure. I think this is a joy. It says a blatant advertisement for the concert by the women's group Coda, which Lydia leads here. It's a fun, nostalgic trip through decades of popular music, and you'll want to sing along even when you're not invited. Come and tap your feet. Sunday, May 4th at 3 p.m. here at UU Santa Fe. There is a sorrow from Dominique to miss that great woman, Tina Cordova, at the environmental justice meeting this afternoon. She's not going to be able to Dominique is not going to be able to be there, but she'll be down in the library for those of you who can be there. Dominique will not be there because she is going to be down at Site Santa Fe speaking about her work for the earth with a number of other women who've been sharing that work. So Dominique, yay. It's Directory Photo Day. Get your picture taken in the foyer after services. Mary and Lee Berg signed the membership book today. Mary and Lee, please wave. Yay, we're glad you're here. And Oh, there's a gift for someone who wants to claim it. This is almost like having a raffle. Kelly Kaler in the back in the treehouse has a spot for someone for the Argentinian dinner tonight at 4, since she can't attend. Go talk to Kelly after the service. We have a sorrow from Ann Urbanski on the death of Lorraine Rance, a longtime friend of the family and one of her mother's high school classmates. Mrs. Rance was also Ann's third grade teacher. She lived to be 100. As May rolls in later this week, Dee Seisman, Ron Gohl, and Paulette Johnson will all be celebrating birthdays. Happy birthday to all of you. Let's see what else is here. Bob Pennington is also celebrating a birthday this week. Happy birthday, Bob. So if you go to Agua Fria Nursery, find Bob and tell him happy. And then one of the great joys here at UU Santa Fe are our visitors. Something about living in Santa Fe means that we have a steady stream of wonderful people passing through. Although lots of them are neighbors. Yay, that means they might come back again. So wave your hand if you are willing when I call your name. Otherwise, we're just going to look for unfamiliar faces during coffee and come and say hello then. So Natalie and Missy and Donna and Edith and Yvonne and Elizabeth and Tracy and Greg. Tracy and Greg are together. Susie and Bobby, yay, and Clarice. Oh, no, Claire, not Clarice, Claire. Yay. Welcome to you all. We hope you'll hang around after the service and join us for some of the other goings-on that are happening here today. If there is room, can you light one more candle for the sorrows and joys we've heard and for all of those we carry in our hearts as yet unspoken. And now, if you would, we're going to sing Spirit of Life. We don't have the gray hymnal out, so you're going to just have to listen or chime in if you know the words.
Spirit of life, come unto me. Sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion. Blow in the wind, rise in the sea, move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. Rules hold me close, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me.
Resting on the echoes of the music, let's move into a time of quiet and contemplation. If you are comfortable doing so, I invite you to close your eyes, to take a breath, and as you exhale, to feel your body begin to relax. Breathe and let your thoughts drift. Breathe and feel your heart begin to unclench. Let it soften and open. Let it unfold until it can cradle all of the sorrows and joys, all of the worries and complexity, all of the beauty and compassion that are part of our world and part of our lives. Breathe. And as we rest together in the quiet, held in one another's affection and regard, I offer you these words from Scott Cooper. We imagine not one path forward, but many. We imagine paths for those who cannot imagine a path of their own. We imagine paths for those who might be experiencing poor health, financial hardship, family crisis, or some other roadblock beyond our experience. We imagine a path forward for those who are forced to leave a homeland against their will, and for those unable to leave a war-torn homeland despite their desire to do so and their lives being in danger. We imagine a path forward for those who leave their homes to make a better life somewhere else, and we ask that we be a welcoming presence along their path. We gather this morning to imagine a path forward for those who feel lonely, for those who despair, for those who look around and do not seem to know where they are living or who our neighbors are, despite the fact that we haven't moved at all. We imagine a path forward where we may be the good we are hoping to find. Truly, we know that as we imagine a way forward and take one another's hands, the paths in front of us will open to hope. The roads will lead to a beloved community, and the arc of the moral universe will bend towards justice, simply because we have dared to travel with love in our hearts. How many of you get the UU World magazine? You should all if you're a member. How many of you have looked at the most recent issue? Okay. How many of you actually read the piece called He Said by Nancy MacDonald Ladd? One. Okay, good. Because now, as something completely different, Mike and I are going to do a condensed version of that as a dramatic reading.
I will first speak as the parliamentarian to you. Boston, January 27th, 1825. 44 white men gathered to discuss the practicality and expediency of forming a Unitarian convention or association to consist of clergymen and laymen and to meet annually or oftener. Having duly chosen a moderator and a secretary, the meeting was called to order and the resolutions were read. Resolution the first. It is desirable and expedient that provision should now be made for the future meetings of the Unitarian and liberal Christians generally. Resolution the second. That a committee consisting of 9 members be appointed to consider with what degree of frequency such shall be held, and to form a plan upon which they shall be conducted, and to report to this body at an adjourned meeting. The motions having been made and seconded, discussion commenced.
I am Andrews Norton, Harvard professor of sacred literature, known to friends and enemies alike as the Unitarian Pope. While some have professed that Unitarianism is to be propagated slowly and silently and without organization, I have heard that both the Quakers and the Methodists have formed organizational structures to promote their respective faiths. Having done so, it seems that neither the Quakers nor the Methodists have fallen entirely into the abyss. And so, unless united in some way, we Unitarians fail to protect the institutions and organizations like the theological schools, including the one that writes my paycheck. Basically, friends, we need to get it together.
William Ellery Channing, the father of American Unitarianism. And as to the subject of association, let it be known that I preferred that it be called a convention. You know that the naming of things is difficult. Also, in my professional opinion, it is my professed opinion that the purpose of such a convention shall be to actually propagate our actual religious views, which cannot be done, as they say, slowly and silently.
Judge Jackson, esteemed member of the Massachusetts Supreme Court, I am opposed to all this tomfoolery and believe it is not becoming or in any way helpful for Unitarians to band together in an association, a convention, or any other kind of party planning committee. Nay.
Reverend Dr. Pierce of Brookline. Indeed, the entire enterprise of founding such an organization is dangerous to all of Unitarianism and to me personally. And I suspect, though I have not asked, if you poll the 75 rural parishes in the interior of the state, pretty much everyone would agree with me. I have heard from unnamed persons that they really don't like this idea.
Henry Ware Jr. I am Henry Ware Jr. And
I have it on good authority. People are talking. No, I won't tell you their names. That's what anonymous means.
Judge Jackson, I suspect that the founding of an association would just give people a distant object of opposition, causing them to spend all of their time fighting about issues far from the concern of the local parishes.
In the role of the parliamentarian, let Mr. Ward speak.
But, sirs, I was just trying to get a word in edgewise to say that all of the distant parishes have been polled. And while not uniformly in agreement, they have weighed in with their general approval. So maybe all of that anonymous feedback wasn't really helpful, good sirs. I'm sorry, sirs, but I am right. I'll go sit down now.
Parliamentarian again. The motion to adjourn did not receive a second, and discussion continued. A letter from a certain Mr. Willard was read approving the proposal. A Mr. Dwight of Springfield said his friend, Mr. Howard, who was not present, favored the object, as did he. Reverend Dr. Pierce rose for the third time to express his fervent opposition. A letter cautioning prudence from the governor of Massachusetts was read to the assembly. The text of the letter is not included in the source material upon which this dramatic reading is based, but though we could assume that it was full of vague guidance offered at a great institutional distance.
Andrews Norton again speaks up and says, "I'm feeling a bit peckish. Perhaps adjournment would be a good idea. I move that a committee be appointed to invite a larger number of gentlemen into this conversation, and that all of us gathered here should take it up over a light repast."
Parliamentarian. The motion was seconded and passed. Membership of this committee was set at 9 members, much like the previous committee. The 9 members were selected, the meeting was adjourned, presumably lunch was obtained. As if these events were not thrilling enough, the really interesting part came sometime after the minutes were concluded. Are you ready for the twist ending? The committee they spent so much time planning for, it never met. The 9 appointed gentlemen never came together. After all that, nothing happened. The subject was deemed too hot to handle, and the general discord too great to be efficiently resolved. And yet, 4 months later, on May 25th, 1825, an energetic group of younger ministers led by James Walker, Henry Ware Jr., and Urza Stiles Gannett, all of whom had been present at that historic debate, went rogue. They arrived at the Berry Street Conference in Boston and personally presented their own plan for a new convention of Unitarian clergy. Met with an affirmation from certain members of that body on May 26, 1825, they chartered the American Unitarian Association. That is how it started.
Sounds amazingly familiar to how it often continues. So I was away last week visiting a family in Concord, Massachusetts, to celebrate Patriots' Day. Patriots' Day is an obscure holiday celebrated mostly in Middlesex County, Massachusetts. It begins on the 18th of April with lanterns hung in the tower of the Old North Church. It follows the ride of Paul Revere and William Dawes, reenacts first contact between the British regulars and the Lexington Minutemen, and concludes with ceremonies on the North Bridge in Concord, where the colonists first fired on the Redcoats and the Revolutionary War began. Last Saturday, was the 250th anniversary of that event. My mother-in-law lives a scant 3 blocks from the North Bridge. And so Nathaniel and I spent last weekend there participating in a number of the observances. We went to the Concord Museum and watched the educational videos. We got up early for the dawn salute at 6 a.m. We helped Nathaniel's sister hang a banner reading "Fight for Democracy" on the wall of the park. We applauded the many fife and drum corps that marched in the parade. The most common placards in the crowd read, "No king then, no king now." Whereas the centennial and bicentennial celebrations included a number of presidential appearances and speeches, it is perhaps unsurprising that no such appearances were part of the festivities this year. What I found stunning about the whole event was the audacious imagination of our forebears, who in a world ruled by kings and popes and emperors took what they knew of ancient Greece and Rome, combined it with what they knew of democratic congregational polity and their own New England town hall meetings, along with the leadership councils that they had watched among their indigenous neighbors, and somehow imagined a nation that could rule itself fairly and wisely without a king. It was a stunning vision. It was one that had ripened over centuries and had been fomenting for decades. It was a vision that captured the hearts and minds of the colonists even against the odds. The Minutemen were not a ragtag group of impromptu protesters. They were organized. They were provisioned. They had trained. And as the British regulars marched out of Boston to capture munitions up in Concord, the riders set off in all directions to rally their neighbors. What began as a few dozen colonists against about 500 British regulars at 5:30 in the morning in Lexington ended with over 3,000 Minutemen from all over the state of Massachusetts harrowing about 1,000 redcoats back to Boston. This in less than 24 hours. Who would have imagined it? And yet, someone did. And they didn't just imagine it. They shared their imaginings with their neighbors. And they started acting on that vision. And we are here because they changed reality. As you just heard in the dramatic or not so dramatic reading that Mike and I did, this year holds an important anniversary for Unitarian Universalists as well. The founding of our American Unitarian Association, which was actually grounded in the imagining of the Reverend William Ellery Channing, as articulated in his sermon, Unitarian Christianity, some 6 years earlier. That was a 90-minute sermon, so much longer than we're used to, preached at the ordination of a young Unitarian minister in Baltimore, and then immediately reprinted, like the same day sent to be reprinted, as a pamphlet to be dispersed throughout the country. In that speech, in that sermon, Channing very gently refuted the core tenets of the Calvinism of the day and articulated a Unitarian counter-narrative. He framed God as singular, not tripartite. Show us the evidence in the Bible. Is there any place where God is referred to as three in one? He framed his speech to argue for a God that is good and loving, rather than a God that is judgmental. He talked about a Jesus that was fully human, like us, which meant that we had a chance of being like him. He understood Jesus' mission and shared his vision that it was to call human beings to moral and compassionate lives, not to throw himself at the feet of a vengeful deity in some form of substitutionary atonement. And finally, Channing understood and preached that all human beings are created in likeness to God. All human beings, not just white men, not just the elect. All human beings are created in likeness to God with reason and agency. They are not essentially sinful and depraved. This was a profound, it's hard for us to imagine how profound. This was a profound reframing of Christianity. As profound a reframing of Christianity as the vision of democracy was a profound reframing of national governance. From these two imaginings, crafted in community through discussion and debate, the shape of our nation and the shape of our Unitarian and eventually Unitarian Universalist faith emerged. Although we have, many of us, left the Christian story behind as our individual guiding narrative, our current identity as Unitarian Universalists, governed by our 7 principles and our 6 core values and grounded in love, still echoes Channing's vision and is faithful to his words. The gathering of Unitarian clergy into the AUA on the occasion of the conference in Berry Street, which still meets every year at General Assembly for a talk from a learned UU minister, that gathering of clergy still shapes how we live into our vision of a better future. What would our world be like if, while living under the thumb of a tyrannical monarch, none had dared imagine a life without kings or a nation where the people governed themselves? What would our UU faith be like if, in a world of the saved and the damned, governed by a capricious deity, no one had dared imagine and then preach that God was love, Jesus was human, and humankind were worthy? In times of strife and chaos and change, imagination is necessary, not simply for fun and profit, but because it is what helps us survive as individuals, as congregations, as cities and states and nations, as ecosystems, as a planet. How fortunate for us, friends, that we are descended twice over from visionaries and their kin who were brave enough and foresighted enough to imagine a better tomorrow and to live their way into that tomorrow together. What futures do you dream of? How might we live our way into those futures together?
The words to extinguish our chalice come from Langston Hughes, one of my favorite poets. Hold fast to dreams, for if dreams die, life is a broken-winged bird that cannot fly. Hold fast to dreams, for when dreams go, life is a barren field frozen with snow.
So I have 5 more very quick things to say to you. First, starting with the one that's furthest away, it is time to get organized for the Pride Parade. And I need a show of hands for how many people will march with us this year. Yes? The Pride Parade is the last Saturday in June. Now's the time we have to reserve a place in the parade and a place for a booth. Watch for a sign-up sheet probably next week to get people involved. All right, that's one. The weekend before the Pride Parade is General Assembly. That is the gathering of those UU ministers and lay people that happens every year to determine the direction of our association. If you would like to be a delegate, UU Santa Fe gets 5 delegates. Come talk to me or to Jim. We cannot pay your way to go to General Assembly, which is in Baltimore this year, but we can generally cover the cost of your registration fee. You can also attend online, which makes it way easier. Then, May 17th, in our fellowship hall from 2 to 5, Braver Angels is offering a workshop. You will need to pre-register because it is going to fill rapidly. Braver Angels is a national organization that helps people on opposite sides of the political divide actually speak to one another thoughtfully and civilly. And it is a training that really supports our commitments to a peaceful resolution of the challenges that we face. Today, we already heard, we have a speaker for environmental justice. We also have a lunch and learn where the Permanent Endowment Committee is going to be leading a conversation on 2 taboo topics, death and money. And leaving a gift, one of those gold bars for UU Santa Fe. The food will be good, the company will be excellent, and I don't know, between that and talking about downwinders, we have a lot of heavy stuff and good eating happening at UU Santa Fe this afternoon. All right, that's it. Grab hands with someone near you. And repeat after me if you would. May love and skill be in our hands. May love and courage fill our hearts. May love and wisdom light our minds. May love flow through us and walk among us as we live our lives and work to heal our world. Amen, shalom, namaste, blessed be, assalamu alaikum, ashe, aho, bon appetit. Have a great afternoon, friends. Thank you for joining us today, friends. We hope that you enjoyed today's service. Please take a little time and explore our website and visit our online welcome table if you'd like to know more about us. Otherwise, we'll see you next Sunday morning. Stay in touch and be well.